Alright, picking up where we left off in the last video here. He started dragging sticks up from the lake and pulling long dead branches down from the hill, never getting out of sight of the water and the ridge. With these, he interlaced and wove a wall across the opening of the front of the rock. It took over 2 hours, and he had to stop several times because he still felt a bit weak, and once because he felt a strange new twinge in his stomach, a tightening, rolling. Too many berries, he thought. I ate too many of them. But it was gone soon, and he kept working until the entire front of the overhang was covered save for a small opening at the right end nearest to the lake. The doorway was about 3 feet, and when he went in he found himself in a room almost 15 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, with the rock wall sloping down at the rear. Good, he said, nodding. Good. Outside, the sun was going down, finally, and in the initial coolness the mosquitoes came out again and clouded in on him. They were thick, terrible, if not quite as bad as in the morning, and he kept brushing them off his arms until he couldn't stand it, and then dumped the berries out and put the torn windbreaker on. At least the sleeves covered his arms. Wrapped in the jacket, with darkness coming down fast now, he crawled back in under the rock and huddled in and tried to sleep. He was deeply tired and still aching some, but sleep was slow coming, and he did not finally settle in until the evening cool turned into night cool and the mosquitoes slowed. Then at last, with his stomach turning on the berries, Brian went to sleep. Chapter 7. Mother! He screamed it, and he could not be sure if the scream awakened him or the pain in his stomach. His whole abdomen was torn with great rolling jolts of pain that doubled him in the darkness of the little shelter, put him over and face down in the sand to moan again and again, Mother, mother, mother. Never anything like this. Never. It was as if all the berries, all the pits, had exploded in the center of him, ripped and tore at him. He crawled out of the doorway and was sick in the sand, then crawled still further and was sick again, vomiting and with terrible diarrhea for over an hour. For over a year, he thought, until he was at last empty and drained of all strength. Then he crawled back into the shelter and fell again to the sand, but could not sleep at first, could not do anything except lie there, and his mind decided to bring the memory up again. In the mall, every detail. His mother sitting in the station wagon with the man, and she had leaned across and kissed the man with the short blonde hair. And it was not a friendly peck, but a kiss. A kiss where she turned her head over at an angle and put her mouth against the mouth of the blond man who was not my father, and kissed, mouth to mouth, and then brought her hand up to touch his cheek, his forehead, while they were kissing. And Brian saw it. Saw this thing that his mother did with the blond man. Saw the kiss that became the secret and his father still did not know all about. The memory was so real he could feel the heat in the mall that day. He could remember the worry that Terry would see and would turn. Excuse me. The memory was so real that he could feel the heat in the mall that day. He could remember the worry that Terry would turn and see his mother. He could remember the worry of the shame of it, and then the memory faded, and he slept again. Awake. For a second, perhaps two. He did not know where he was. Was still in his sleep somewhere. Then he saw the sun streaming in the open doorway of the shelter and heard the close, vicious whine of mosquitoes and knew. He brushed his face completely welted now, with 2 days of bites, completely covered with lumps and bites, and was surprised to feel the swelling on his forehead had gone down a great deal. It was almost gone. The smell was awful, and he couldn't place it. Then he saw the pile of berries at the back of the shelter and remembered the night and being sick. Too many of them, he said aloud. Too many gut cherries. He crawled out of the shelter and found where he'd messed the sand. He used sticks and cleaned it as best as he could, covered it with clean sand, and went down to the lake to wash his hands and get a drink. It was still very early, only just past true dawn, and the water was so calm that he could see his reflection. It frightened him. The face was cut and bleeding, swollen and lumpy. The hair all matted, and on his forehead a cut that had healed but left the hair sticking with blood and scab. His eyes were slits in the bites, and he had somehow covered with dirt. He slapped the water with his hands to destroy the mirror. Ugly, he thought. Very, very ugly. And he was, at the moment, almost overcome with self-pity. He was dirty and starving and bitten and hurt and lonely and ugly and afraid and so completely miserable that it was like being in a pit, a deep, dark pit with no way out. So he sat back on the bank and fought crying, then let it come and cried for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. Long tears, self-pity tears, wasted tears. He stood, went back to the water, and took small drinks. As soon as the cold water hit his stomach, he felt the hunger sharpen, and as it had before, he had stood and held his abdomen until the hunger cramps receded. He had to eat. He was weak with it again, down with the hunger, and he had to eat. Back at the shelter, the berries lay in a pile where he had dumped them when he grabbed his windbreaker. Gut cherries, he called them in his mind now, and he thought of eating some of them. Not such a crazy amount as he had, which he felt brought on the sickness in the night, but just enough to stave off the hunger a bit. He crawled into the shelter. Some flies were on the berries, and he brushed them off. He selected only the berries that were solidly ripe. Not the light red ones, but the berries that were dark maroon red to black, and swollen with ripeness. When he had a small handful of them, he went back down to the lake and washed them in the water. Small fish scattered away when he splashed the water, and he wished he had fishing line and a hook. When he ate them carefully, spitting out the pits, they were still tart, but had a sweetness to them, although they seemed to make his lips a bit numb. When he finished, he was still hungry, but the edge was gone, and his legs didn't feel as weak as they had. He went back to the shelter. It took him half an hour to get through the rest of the berries and sort them, putting all the fully ripe ones in a pile on some leaves, the rest in another pile. When he was done, he covered the 2 piles with grass he tore from the lake shore to keep the flies off, and went back outside. They were awful berries, those gut cherries, he thought, but they were food. There was food there, food of some kind, and he could eat a bit more later tonight if he had to. For now, he had a full day ahead of him. He looked at the sky through the trees and saw that while there were clouds, they were scattered and didn't seem to hold rain. There was a light breeze that seemed to keep the mosquitoes down, and, he thought, looking up along the lakeshore, if there was one kind of berry, there should be other kinds, sweeter kinds. If he kept the lake in sight, as he had done yesterday, he should be all right, should be able to find home again. And it stopped him. He had actually thought it at that time. Home. 3 days. No, 2. Or was it 3? Yes, this was the 3rd day, and he had thought of the shelter as home. He turned and looked at it, studied the crude work. The brush made a fair wall, not weather-tight, but it cut most of the wind off. He hadn't done so badly at that. Maybe it wasn't much, but also maybe it was all he had for a home. All right, he thought, so I'll call it a home. He turned back and set off up the side of the lake, heading for the gutcherry bushes, his windbreaker in his hand. Things were bad, he thought, but maybe not that bad. Maybe he could find some more berries. When he came to the gutcherry bushes, he paused. The branches were empty of birds, but still had many berries. Some of those that had been merely red yesterday were now a dark maroon to black, much riper. Maybe he should stay and pick them to save them. But the explosion in the night was still much in his memory, and he decided to go on. Gut cherries were food, but tricky to eat. He needed something better. Another 100 yards up the shore there was a place where the wind had torn another path. These must have been fierce winds, he thought, to tear places up like this, as they had the path he had found with the plane he had when he crashed. Here the trees were not all the way down, but twisted and snapped off halfway up from the ground. So their tops were all down and rotting and gone, leaving the snags poking into the sky like broken teeth. It made for tons of dead and dry wood, and he wished once more he could get a fire going. It also made a kind of clearing. With the tops of the trees gone, the sun could get down to the ground, and it was filled with small, thorny bushes that were covered with berries. Raspberries. These he knew because there were some raspberry bushes in the park, and he and Terry were always picking and eating them when they biked past. The berries were full and ripe, and he tasted one to find it sweet, and with none of the problems of the gut cherries, although they did not grow in clusters. There were many of them, and they were easy to pick, and Brian smiled and started eating. Sweet juice, he thought. Oh, they were sweet, which is a tiny tang, and he picked and ate and picked and ate and thought that had never tasted anything as good. Soon, as before, his stomach was full. But now he had some sense and did not gorge or cram more down. Instead, he picked more and put them in his windbreaker, feeling the morning sun on his back and thinking he was rich. Rich with food now, just rich. And he heard a noise to his rear, a slight noise, and he turned and saw the bear. Alright, we're going to stop there, and we'll pick it up in the next installation. Thanks, guys.